Morning, everybody. Thanks for joining this call. I'm very honored that you all have invited me and that you all have taken some time off. Whether you're live or watching this as a recording, I'm very appreciative. So I think I will switch to my slides now. Yeah, so as Tim mentioned, I'm a writer. I've been a writer my entire career. And if you see the three images up there, on the left is the Economist magazine. I used to work for the company. That was my only real full-time job. I was there for 7 years. The image in the middle is my first book, Floating on a Malayan Breeze, that Tim mentioned. And that kind of signifies my independent writing career. After I left The Economist, I was freelance for about 8 or 9 years. And then the image on the right is JOM, JOM, which is a Malay word meaning let's or let's go, let's do something together. And that's the name of the media company that I co-founded in 2022. And that's been what's occupying me for the past 2 years. So essentially, I work at a startup now. It's a weekly magazine. And that, again, is a very different part of my writing career. So I think through the talk, I'll talk about three sections of my writing career. First, at a very established, traditional British media company, The Economist. Then my freelance life, and then JOM, which I've been doing for the past 2 years now, which is a startup. And again, even though I'm a writer there and editor, it's a very different kind of work. What I want to say up front is that, I've always loved writing. I think I remember winning my first essay competition when I was 10 or 11 years old, probably around the age of some of you there. And what was interesting to me is that when I was a kid, I never actually thought that writing would be a viable career. That was in the late 80s and 90s. I didn't quite see opportunities to be a writer in Singapore. But as I grew older, more and more opportunities evolved, came up in Singapore. And so I was finally able to do something that I didn't think possible as a kid. And so I think the main message I have actually is not so much about trying to convince anybody out there to be a writer. Some of you like writing, some of you may not like writing, but it's more just to get you all to dream about possibilities as you grow up, because you may enjoy doing something as a kid and you may not see any job opportunities or professional opportunities in Singapore. But Singapore is such a vibrant, wonderful place, and there are new opportunities coming up every day. So that's what I actually want to tell you all. Don't worry about your passion or whatever brings you fulfillment, not seeing a job that's attached to that. I think the economy and the society is evolving so much that what you actually like doing now might actually turn out to be a job later on in life in a way that you never actually quite expected. So hold on to that dream, whatever it might be, even though you don't see the reality of the job right now. So let me talk briefly about my career thus far. I'm going to start from 2006, when I returned to Singapore after 6 years in university in America. So if any of you have questions about my primary school, secondary school, JC, Army, or my 6 years in university in America, 4 years as an undergrad, 2 years as a master's student, I can talk about that later in Q&A. But I will start the story from 2006, when I returned to Singapore after university. And so I joined The Economist in 2006. I joined a unit called Economist Corporate Network. And then in 2010, I joined a unit called Economist Insights. I'll talk a bit more about those units later. In 2012, I published my first book. That's the Floating on a Malayan Breeze. In 2013, I left the company. That was difficult and traumatic in some ways because, for the first time in my life, I didn't have a big brand name institution. I didn't have a stable job. And so it was a bit scary, but I'm glad I did it. on hindsight, because it allowed me to do a lot of different things. And then if you look at the lower half of the slide, that's when I entered my freelance, self-employed or bum phase. Some of my friends said I had become a bum because I had left full-time work and had started working for myself. I started work on my third book, which is about India and China. It's still ongoing. 2014, I published my second book. 2015, so about 2 years after I left, my freelance income and workflow had become stable. And then in 2022, that was the start of the third stage of my career, which is co-founding the company called JOM. So that's the timeline of my career in brief, and I'll get into some detail now. So the very first job I had after university was at a unit called Economist Corporate Network. Now, I'm not going to get into the detail of this slide here, but basically what I did for those 4 years was communicate to senior executives, people in big organizations, NGOs, government. I communicated to them knowledge about Southeast Asia. So this slide, as you can see, is about Malaysia. And I used to tell them about politics, society, and economic developments in the different countries. So for 4 years, I was doing that. And this involved me having to read up a lot about the region, having to travel around Southeast Asia quite a bit, having to talk to many people about what was going on in the region, and then synthesizing those views, writing about it, communicating those views to businesses, government, who were very interested in knowing what was going on. So I kind of played the role of an analyst, and that meant essentially analyzing things for others. And so the key skill here is one of digesting information and then communicating it to others, which is a very important skill in many facets of life. Again, I won't get into the details of what's on the slide here, but this is a typical slide that I used to present to senior people in organizations. And I did this for about 4 years. My job was based both in Singapore and Hong Kong. So I used to fly up and down between Singapore and Hong Kong. And that was a lot of fun as well, just being able to experience work and life in two different cities. So I did that for 4 years. And then after that, I switched within the company. One of the nice things of working in a big company is that you have many different opportunities to move around in different roles and do different things. And so I switched to a unit called Economist Insights. And what Economist Insights did essentially is produce these big reports. These are reports that would sometimes cost $100,000, $200,000 to the client. So in this case, if you look at this report that I've highlighted there called Hotspots, Benchmarking Global City Competitiveness, this was commissioned by Citi, a large financial services institution. And I think they paid like $200,000 to the Economist, not to me, unfortunately, but they paid it to the Economist. I was an employee at the Economist. And what we used to do is basically run the research. In this case, it was ranking different cities around the world in terms of their global city competitiveness. So we do the research, we would write the report, and then this was probably the biggest project I worked on. If you look at that photograph in the bottom right, that's Mayor Bloomberg from New York City, who was actually talking about the research that we had done in Singapore and Hong Kong and London. It was very exciting working on this as well because it was a sort of multi-team, multi-city project. So I used to get on calls with people from all over the world, and we would basically collaborate to put together this report, which finally, got a lot of publicity, including from the mayor of New York City. So it was fun and exciting to work on this very big project. And just to give you a sense for timeline, some of these projects probably take about 6 to 8 months to complete. So you're working very intensely over a long period of time. And again, this is a different kind of writing because it is writing in a report you're writing to communicate again to senior executives and government and business leaders. So it's a very different kind of writing from writing a storybook or writing a, shorter book that may go out to the general market. This is a very specialized kind of writing that's targeted at senior executives and government officials. So I think what was useful for me in my career is just learning how to write in different styles. And that's something I got to do here as well. So, I think with a lot of jobs, the actual work that you do that fulfills your mandate is just a part of it. It's a big part of it, but it's just a part of it. There's a lot of other stuff that goes on in the company that's fun and exciting. So on the left side, if you see the Economist magazine, which is a weekly magazine, we call it newspaper within the company, but most of the world calls it a magazine. I got to write for the magazine as well. And that cover there with Barack Obama, former president of the US, that was the issue where my first ever article came out. And so, yeah, it was quite exciting I think I was 31 at that time, to have my work published in a very big, prestigious international publication. Since then, I've published, as Tim mentioned, I've published in many different international publications, but I think that was kind of my first break in a way. And it's just fun to be a Singaporean sitting in Singapore and knowing that the work that I produce is being read by people all over the world. It's quite, it's good validation as a writer for what you've done and what you've achieved. The photograph in the lower right, I just put that there as a fun photograph. We took part in the Singapore Marathon, which is every December. It's sometimes called the Stanchart Marathon or the Singapore Marathon. So the Economist sent a team to participate in the marathon. We raised funds for a charity in Singapore through our running. So that's just an example of some of the fun things you get to do while working at a company. So I wanted to describe what a typical day at the Economist Group was like, so you have a sense for what work as a writer is like. There are probably about 3 to 4 hours of reading every day. Newspapers, magazines, websites, anything you could get your hands on. Basically, it was a mix of reading to prepare you for the actual job you were doing, but also often it's important to read quite broadly as a writer. So you're not just reading specifically for your job, but you're reading other stuff that might actually give you ideas about new narratives, or they might give you ideas about new ways to write and to communicate your message to your audience. So if you want to be a writer, if there are any budding writers out there, I think it's important to remember that a key part of writing is actually reading. You can never be a good writer if you don't read a lot. And it may seem self-evident to some of you, but not to everybody. So yeah, you need to read a lot if you want to be a writer. A typical day would also involve 2 to 3 hours of writing and talking. This, again, is quite broad depending on what the day holds. And also, I think The Economist is pretty good in that we didn't have that much administrative work, but I think you can never really escape administrative work wherever you are. So I would have 1 to 2 hours of admin work, emails, telephone chats, meetings, and so on. Why I loved my job. I've always loved reading. I've always loved finding out about the world, and I got to do a lot of that. So it was fun for somebody to pay me to actually read. It's fun for somebody to pay me to actually write, which I really enjoy. There was also a fabulous office atmosphere. The Economist was a very flat organization. What do I mean by flat? It means, there's not much of a hierarchy. There's not much of like sort of great respect or like, bowing down in deference to my bosses. I could walk into my boss's office anytime. I could disagree with my boss anytime. I had access to a lot of stuff that was going on in the company. A lot of stuff was shared with me even as a junior employee. So I think that's a really nice environment to be in, because you feel like you can really participate and be part of something bigger when you have a flat structure. I had a lot of smart colleagues, so a lot of my learning and information absorption wasn't just from reading other stuff, was also from talking to my colleagues, and I think that's a very important thing to have when you want to be working in a fun environment, in a dynamic environment. It's really important to have colleagues that you respect, who are smart. I really liked the flexible work hours and dress code that the Economist had. So there weren't many rules about, how you should look and what hours you should work. As long as you got the job done, nobody really cared when you were there or what you were doing, which was nice. And the pay was pretty good too. Yeah, so I think that was important in a way for the early part of my career to have decent salary, because that kind of helped me build a stable base to allow me to do a lot of the other things I did later on in life. So I think, for example, if I had just left university and gone and done my own thing with a low salary, I think it would have been much harder for me to do what I'm doing today. But the fact that I joined a big company, had a stable job with a decent pay, allowed me to earn a decent income, allowed me to build my base, which helped me later on in life. What should you do if you want a job like that? Well, again, you should read a lot, especially The Economist. I mean, it's a bit of a joke, but I think that you should read whatever you are interested in becoming, right? So if you're interested in writing for the Straits Times, for example, you should actually read a lot of the Straits Times and follow what they're saying. If you're interested in writing for a big international publication, you should be very familiar with their work, So it's important to familiarize yourself with what you want to be or what you want to become. If you want to become a famous novelist and write the great Singapore story, you should actually read a lot of novels and read a lot of Singapore literature. So it's important to do that. Learn to stand up and speak out, learn to challenge and question authority. I think those are very important skills to have, especially in an environment like that where the contestation of ideas is very important. So you need to slowly develop the courage to be able to challenge ideas with people who are older than you. And I think sometimes there's a bit of fear as a young person in terms of challenging somebody who's senior to you. But I think, particularly in the writing world, but I think elsewhere as well, I think, you should try to get over that fear, because I think a lot of older people actually welcome younger people who challenge their ideas. I think it's an important thing to learn how to do. Learn as much as you can about the world outside the classroom. I think Singapore and many other countries, not just Singapore, but that there tends to be an emphasis on your paper grades or an emphasis on your textbooks and what you learn in the classroom. I think that's changing a lot. It's changed a lot since I was a kid, but still that emphasis is there. And I think it's important to keep learning outside of the classroom as much as you can. And finally, any college degree is fine. I think to be a writer, you don't actually need to have a specialized field of study. So this is very different from being a doctor or a lawyer, where you need to study medicine or law specifically. I think with being a writer or an analyst in many different industries, you don't actually need a specialized college degree. So, up till the point of 20, 21 years old, I think you can kind of study whatever you want, study something that interests you, and you can eventually always still become a writer regardless of what you study. Some of the best writers at the Economist Group, some were history majors, some were law majors. There weren't that many journalism majors. Of course, we had some journalism majors, but we had people who had studied all kinds of different things. And I think it's more important to study something you're passionate about and you can get really good at, as opposed to studying journalism per se. So yeah, any college degree is fine for a job like this. So, what did I do after 2012? Well, this is the phase where I kind of went out on my own and tried to make it on my own. I put these photographs here. You might be wondering what these are about, but I spent 8 months traveling from South India to Beijing in preparation for my third book, which is going to be a story about India and China. And I specifically visited all the martial arts schools in India and China. So on the lower left, you have me visiting a Gatka school in Punjab. Punjab is where Punjabis are from. The most recognizable people in Singapore who are Punjabis are the Sikhs. The men all wear turbans, or most of them wear turbans. And so that was the lower left is me, a photograph of me in Punjab in India, visiting a martial arts school. And the lower right is me visiting probably the most famous martial arts school in the world, which is in Shaolin Temple in China. So why did I visit martial arts schools? Where I'm trying to use martial arts as a lens to tell a story about India and China. So unfortunately, I haven't finished this book yet. So, what started out as a 5 to 6 year project is now probably a 10 to 15 year project. I'm hoping to finish it in the next few years. So I'm still working on this book. But yeah, this is the first thing that I did after leaving the Economist in 2013. What I also did and continue to do is make appearances at writers' festivals and other sorts of forums where people want to talk to writers or learn from writers. So this is me speaking at a forum at the Georgetown Literary Festival in Penang. And these sorts of events are very important, not just for my own learning, but also in terms of getting my name out there, getting some publicity for the kind of work that I do. So book writing doesn't pay the bills. So how did I actually earn money and pay the bills? And I think this is a good juncture to make a very important point. I think it's important to follow your passion and do something that fulfills you, but it's also important to make enough money. I think sometimes people say that money doesn't matter, but money does matter to some degree. You need enough money to get by in life. And so you always have to figure out how to make enough. Money isn't everything, but money is something. So you need to figure out what's the right level of financial security that you need. And so how did I make money? Well, 30% of my time during my freelance days was spent on speaking engagements, consulting work, writing and editing reports, external book projects, and advertorial writing. And so on the lower right there, you see an example of a project that I worked on in 2015, which was Singapore's 50th birthday of sorts since independence. There were a whole bunch of projects going on. And one of those that I worked on was a book called Singapore's Scientific Pioneers, where we basically profiled a bunch of Singapore's early scientists, people from the 70s and 80s who had done important work in the field of science. And so this is an example of a project that was fun to work on, but also, paid me a decent amount of money. And this was the sort of project that I did on the side to earn money while I was working on my book about India and China. So I think it's important to give you some of the pros and cons of being a freelancer or bum, as some of my friends say. Mm, I think a lot of freedom in my work, to choose my work, to work when I want, to work where I want. I could, because of the internet, as you know, I could basically sit anywhere. I could sit on a beach. I could travel to KL to stay at my auntie's house and work from there. You don't actually have to be in a specific location anymore to do a lot of this kind of work, which is a great kind of freedom to have. I had a lot of intellectual independence, very little time spent on administration, which I still had to do at The Economist. There was a lot more ownership of work and satisfaction. So because you're an independent freelancer, you actually feel a lot of ownership over the work that you do, whether it's my book writing, whether it's the scientific pioneer book that I worked on, that there's a lot more of a direct connection between me and the actual work that I'm doing, as opposed to, if you remember, working at the Economist, working on these big reports that ultimately get sent to New York and are talked about by New York's mayor. There's less of a connection between me, the individual, and the actual final product, right? Because it's this big project that a lot of people are working on. But as a freelancer, there's a more direct connection between my work and myself. And the last thing on the pro side, if you see there, it also prepared me for the next stage of my life, which was starting a company. And what I mean by prepared me, I think as a freelancer with that 8 or 9 years, I actually had a lot of freedom to think about new ways of doing things. So as you probably know, the media world has changed dramatically over the past 20 years. It used to be print magazines, print newspapers, in the 1990s. And now a lot of it has gone digital. So a lot of people now read on their mobile phones, they read on their computers. It's a completely new media world. People watch videos as opposed to reading. And so having that 8 or 9 years as a freelancer actually allowed me to think and to experiment with new ways of doing media, which I wouldn't have gotten to do if I was still at The Economist. It would have been a much more constrained environment. So I think that's another advantage of being a freelancer, is that you get the freedom to think about how your particular work might be changing. And I think that's relevant for a lot of you because, as you all know, the nature of work is changing quite dramatically year to year. What is the downside of being a freelancer? No stable income. That was that was the first thing that was difficult for me to get used to. I think you're always on the lookout for work, and that can be quite nerve-wracking. It can be quite traumatic to sometimes worry about where your next paycheck is going to come from. Social acceptance. Yeah, I think in Singapore, it's getting more acceptable now to be a freelancer or independent contractor, but still your friends are probably going to make fun of you, as my friends did. If you choose not to work for a big company, if you choose to do your own thing. So that's something you have to get used to. And the other thing is, if you're a freelancer and doing your own thing, there's very little direction, so the career path is not very clear. That can be a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing. You need to have a lot more intrinsic motivation and direction about how you want to grow, how you want to develop yourself professionally. Whereas when you're working in a big company like The Economist, you have HR managers, you have bosses who are constantly guiding you, shepherding you, training you, mentoring you, telling you how you can develop as an individual, how you can develop as a worker, which is useful in many ways. So I think one of the cons of doing your own thing is you don't really have the guidance from somebody senior to you. Finally, I would like to talk briefly about the last stage of my life right now, which is the third stage. Just to recap, I started off at The Economist, then I was a freelancer, and then for the past 2 years, I've been co-founder of this company called JOM. And JOM is a weekly magazine, digital only. So we publish every Friday and we cover Singapore. We call ourselves a general interest magazine. What does that mean, general interest? It means we write about everything from arts and culture to politics, business, technology. We write about everything, as opposed to being a specialized political magazine or being a specialized arts magazine or a specialized current affairs magazine. JOM is a general interest magazine. We publish once a week, and we have a core team of about 5 people. And then we have additional adjunct people who are part of the team, another 5. And then we also have a big network of contributors who frequently send in articles which are published in JOM. So you can log on to jom.media and see what we're like. I won't bore you too much anymore with the publication itself. But I will tell you a bit more about what led me down this path, how JOM fits into my career and my development as a writer. So why did I start JOM, or why did I co-found JOM? I have two co-founders, so there are three of us. I think the first point there is creating something bigger than myself. So if you think about me being a freelancer, a lot of that was just I and me, right? With JOM, what I wanted to do was, try to create an institution or an organization that was not attached to my name necessarily, but that could be bigger than me, that could outlive me, that hopefully will still be around after I'm long gone, and will be an important part of the media landscape in Singapore. So you may know that, in Singapore, we've got the mainstream media, which is quite dominant, companies like the Straits Times and Today and MediaCorp. But you also have a bunch of smaller companies like Mothership, Rice Media, Must Share News. And I think JOM wants to be a part of the smaller players, who can help to add a lot to Singapore's media landscape to offer new views. And that gets to my second point, which is the hunger in society for alternative views. So I think, again, this is how the entire media industry has shifted in the last 30 years. I think in today's world, there are a lot of people who are hungry for alternative views, and alternative views can come in many different shapes and form. It can be a TikTok influencer who is sharing their thoughts on particular issues over TikTok. It can be somebody on Instagram. It can be a website like JOM. It can be many different forms actually today. And so the media landscape is very diverse and very interesting in many ways today. And I think that's another reason why we co-founded JOM, because we felt that we had an important role to play in this diverse media landscape that you're seeing today in Singapore. The third point is funding. I think now I'm 47 years old, and I don't think I could have started JOM when I was in my 30s because I was still very young. I was relatively new in my career. I don't think people would have invested in the company. But now in my mid 40s, there was a lot of available funding for me. And I think that's another interesting thing for all of you to take note of, that, if you have ideas that you want to pursue, actually in Singapore today, there are a lot of avenues for you to get funding, investors to actually help fund your ideas. So that actually was a key part of why we started JOM. In 2022, there were actually a bunch of 15 Singaporeans who were actually willing to put in money to support this new venture. So that was an important part of it. Point number four, the energy and excitement of the startup world. I think when I first started JOM in 2022, it was extremely stressful for me because after having been on my own for 8 or 9 years, suddenly I was thrown into this chaotic, hectic world where I had so many different things going on. One day I'd be talking to the accountant, trying to figure out our books. Another day I'd be recruiting new people for the company. And so there's just a lot of stuff going on. It was very, very stressful. But I think the flip side of the stress is that there's a lot of energy and excitement in the startup world. Things are changing very quickly. You get to experiment and tinker a lot with stuff. And that's really a lot of fun at the end of the day, even though it's stressful and tiring, and I don't get enough sleep, which you may be able to see through the screen right now. But it's still very exciting. Um, Point number five, the fulfillment of creating something with others. I think it's a lot of fun to be on my own, but it's a different kind of fun to be building something with other people. So I've got a great team and we work really well together. A lot of them have become my personal friends as well. And I think just seeing something, take shape from just an idea. We just had a very simple idea. Let's create a magazine on Singapore. And day by day, it slowly comes to fruition, right? We didn't even have a name, just the process of choosing a name, JOM, the process of choosing the exact font to use for JOM was all that is very, very interesting. And it's a lot of fun when you actually can create something that resonates with people out there in Singapore, just from an idea. And I think that whole process is actually a lot of fun and very exciting. And finally, the last point is I actually still have many of the freedoms that I did in the past. So even though I told you that as a freelancer, I had a lot of freedom to do a lot of things, I think some of those freedoms are still there. I still work the hours that I want. I can still choose the location where I want to do most of my work. So I can still work at home. I can travel overseas and do my work for JOM from overseas. So I think it's still very flexible in that sense. And I think a lot of startup work in today's world is quite flexible, which is also a great thing. And yeah, thank you for your patience. My last slide here, and I just wanted to say, yeah, do something that fulfills you. And I'll just repeat the point that two points I made one at the start, one in the middle. You need to find something that fulfills you and pursue it. And don't be afraid if your passion isn't in a recognizable job today, because maybe by the time you grow up, that job would have been created, or maybe you'll do the creation of the job that you want. And also, don't believe the people who say that money doesn't matter. I think Singapore, as you all know, is a very expensive place to live in. So yes, you need your passion. Yes, you need something that fulfills you, but you also need to figure out a way to make a bit of money out of it to, pay the bills. Yeah. So, and thank you, Tim and Yale. I will hand it over back to you right now.
Oh, last time you told us asking questions about your school life before university. So could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. I see a question from Dawn as well, but I'll answer that question first, Tim. So you asked me to talk about my school life before university. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Sure. So I and sorry if this gets very boring, but I'll try to be fast. I went to St. Andrews Primary and Junior School, I went to St. Andrews Primary School, also known as Junior School, and then to St. Andrews Secondary School, which is in Potong Pasir, that pink building. And that was a lot of fun, very interesting. I think I made some of my best friends there, relationships that are still very important to me today. So those of you who are in primary school, some of the people around you are going to be very important relationships for your whole life. And my teachers, some of the teachers who taught me then still continue to be very influential in my life even today. They're still great influences. And then after that, I went to Raffles Junior College. So some of my classmates weren't very happy that I switched from St. Andrews to Raffles. They thought I was selling out. They would have preferred me to go to St. Andrews JC. But I think on hindsight, it was a good experience because you know, Raffles is a good school, and I also, from a social perspective, got exposed to a very different kind of group of people. So, the demographics of St. Andrews School is very different from the demographics of Raffles. So I like the fact that I have two very different kind of groups of friends now who've done very different things in life. And I think that benefits me a lot, and I have great relationships with both sides. After RJC, I went to Army, and then I got into a few universities. I finally decided on Berkeley, the University of California at Berkeley, which is near San Francisco. And so I was there for 4 years. I I went there wanting to study business, and I wanted to be an investment banker. I remember get my degree very quickly, and then become a banker and make lots of money. But then when I was in Berkeley, I think Berkeley opened my eyes to a lot of things around the world, and I actually ended up doing. I still did my business degree, but I also did geography, which had always been my first love in many ways. So I got a degree in geography. And yeah, then I during the course of those 4 years, I kind of decided that I didn't really want to be a banker anymore, but I wanted to do something different, something that could address social justice issues around the world, to work more closely with communities. And that finally led me to do a master's in public policy. So I did a master's in public policy at Harvard. It's called the Harvard Kennedy School. And so I was there from 2003 to 2005. Coincidentally, one of my classmates, the first year, is our new Prime Minister, Lawrence Wong. So Lawrence and we actually overlapped for 1 year in my master's program. Um, it's not like we're very, very good friends, but I certainly know Lawrence. He's a very nice guy. I'm happy that he's Prime Minister. And yeah, and then I came back to Singapore in 2005, 2006, which is when I then joined the Economist Group. Should I answer Dawn's questions on the chat now? Let me do that. Dawn said, you mentioned that any college degree would do. Does it mean that journalism degree has no unique edge? Well, I think, journalism is one of those things that you can study in the classroom, but you can also study through practice, right? Through actually doing it. So I think, uh, yes, it does have a unique edge in that I think people who go through journalism school, they become very equipped with some of the theoretical concepts, whether it's around investigative journalism or different forms of journalism. But I would argue that a lot of things that you learn in journalism school, you can actually learn later on the ground, actually doing your job. So yeah, it's different. To reiterate an earlier point, it's different from your classical professional degrees like law and medicine, where I think you actually do need to go to school. So there is a bit of an edge, Don, but that edge can be made up for through the practice of journalism later on in the working world. Don's second question. For kids who are interested in journalism and politics, what are the prospects in Singapore as a full-time journalist? Knowing how restrictive local political analysis can be, is it better to just join independent or global media companies? Well, I think, um, well, it's a tough question because, um, on the one hand, some of the most important, most lucrative, um, and most easily accessible full-time jobs in Singapore are with the mainstream media companies. So Straits Times, Today, MediaCorp, companies like that. And I think at the end of the day, even though the climate can be a bit restrictive, they still are very good places for you to learn, very good places for you to learn the art of being a journalist, the trade of being a journalist. So I have many friends who, work at these mainstream media companies, and for young people wanting to, enter journalism, I would still recommend the mainstream media as a potential employer, while being aware of the restrictions that the mainstream media has. I think we're all aware of the restrictions in the mainstream media. There are certain things you can and cannot do. And I think, as long as you're aware of that, then I think it's a good place to train yourself. Now, of course, if you have the opportunity to join a big international media company like I did, then that's a viable option for a lot of people. There aren't that many of those jobs around. Increasingly, there are, because Singapore is an important media center for a lot of international media. It's a big base in Asia, or Southeast Asia at least, for a lot of the big companies, Bloomberg, BBC, The Economist. A lot of them have big bases here. And I think there are increasingly more and more jobs in Singapore for that kind of work. So I think both are extremely viable careers at the mainstream media or at big global companies. As a first job to join an independent media company like JOM, for example, I think it can be interesting, but I think you also have to be aware that You may not get the training that you get at the bigger companies. You may not get the salary that you get at the bigger companies. So I think depending on the individual, they might prefer joining a bigger established company as opposed to going independent from day one. I think there are pros and cons of that, and I think it really depends on the individual's capacity for risk, the individual's own intrinsic motivation in terms of developing themselves. Yeah, so there are a bunch of things to think about before you decide which media company to join. What were you reading in your school years? Wow. I read a lot of stuff, everything from, um, Shakespeare text that I was assigned to in secondary school to contemporary fiction to a lot of non-fiction. Non-fiction would have come in the form of things like, everything from classical Singapore texts like Lee Kuan Yew's memoirs, to big thought idea books from overseas as well. I also read a lot of newspapers and magazines when I was in school. So I was reading The Economist from quite a young age, maybe 15, 16. Now, I didn't understand a lot of the words in The Economist when I was a teenager, so I always had my dictionary next to me. But I kind of forced myself to read those things. And yeah, I think I just read very broadly. I had parents who encouraged me to read very broadly. When I was in school, there wasn't the internet yet. I think I finished my JC in 1995, if I'm not wrong. So the internet was just coming about, so I most of my reading was offline. Unlike a lot of you, I guess a lot of your reading might be online. So that was a big difference. Was I always interested in current affairs? Yes, I was always interested in current affairs. I think from quite a young age, I was interested in, how larger structures of power, whether it's governments or big companies, affect our lives. So I think I was always interested in that. I will just say another thing about reading in school years. What I do tell young people these days is that, given the wealth of information that you have online, you don't have to restrict yourself just to reading. I think reading is very important, but I think you can also get a lot of information from YouTube, from other video channels as well. Now, of course, you don't want to spend all your time watching videos. You don't want to spend all your time scrolling through TikTok and things like that, because there are obviously bad side effects of too much social media, whole bunch of reasons, which are increasingly clear to a lot of us. But I think it would be wrong to totally block yourself off from video, from podcasts, from new formats that are out there, because I think they are very important sources of information as well. So I today try to get my information both from reading, but also from videos and from podcasts and from many of the new media formats. I think it's important. Yale asks, what's your favorite area to cover and write about? I think in Singapore, a lot of people like to read my political analysis. I write about Singapore politics quite a lot, but it's not necessarily my favorite area. I can do it, and I think I'm decent at it, but it's not my favorite area. I think my favorite area is actually travel journalism. And when I say travel journalism, I don't mean like, top 5 places to have nasi lemak in KL kind of thing. I mean like, traveling through a country for a long period of time, like I did for my first book, which is on Malaysia and Singapore, and I'm doing for my third book, which is on China and India. You travel through a country for a long period of time, you learn about the people, you learn about the culture, and then you write about the people and culture, and you look at similarities and differences between your own life and theirs. You try to think about why the human condition is different in one place versus another. And I think that's my favorite kind of writing, actually. I'll go to Tim's question next. What are your thoughts on the media environment in the Philippines or any other Southeast Asian countries? So, um, now I think in Southeast Asia, traditionally, we've had governments that tend to be quite dominant, and media companies which are quite closely aligned with the government in many ways, and the government tends to exert a lot of control on media companies. That's true in a lot of Southeast Asia. Now, there are some major exceptions, and I think the Philippines is a good country to mention. Tim, obviously you're there. But some of the most important new media companies actually are from the Philippines. So I mean, Rappler is the big one, and I think you do have a lot of interesting new media ideas coming out of different parts of Southeast Asia. So in Malaysia, for example, there's a company called Malaysia Kini that's very important. And you have a lot of these new companies challenging the dominant players, challenging the dominant ways of discourse and journalism, which in a way is very inspiring, very exciting. So I think Southeast Asia is interesting because you have both the dominant players, like I said, which are important, but you also have a lot of interesting examples of new companies who are sort of fighting against that tide, and we can draw a lot of inspiration from that. Yeah. Next question from Joel Lim. How did you stay disciplined while freelancing and managing your own journalism website? Yeah, I think discipline as a freelancer is important, and it's not easy. Um, I remember when I first became a freelancer, I used to take afternoon naps all the time. So, once you don't have the rigor and limits and um, sort of guidelines to follow at a regular job, you might go in the other direction, and I think it's just a matter of finding the right balance between work and rest and leisure, and that probably took me about 2 or 3 years to get that balance. So after I left my full-time job, when I became a freelancer, after about 2 to 3 years, I think I had the right rhythm about discipline, when to write, when to rest, when to take naps, when to play, so on and so forth. And so I think it's only in the last maybe 10 years that I found the rhythm and discipline that works for me. So I tend to wake up very early. I usually wake up at 5 or 5:30, and I do most of my work before lunch. So I do most of my productive work in the early morning till around 12 or 1 o'clock. And then after lunch, I try to do other things. When I say other things, I try to read. I try to have conversations with people that I might want to have conversations with. And I've kind of followed this rhythm roughly for the past 8 to 10 years. And I think that's a rhythm that works for me. So yeah, to Joel's question, I would say that you got to just budget some time for yourself to learn about yourself and learn about the own rhythms that work for you. Not everybody works like me. I mean, some of my colleagues at JOM, they prefer to, they prefer to work late into the night. They work till 11 o'clock sometimes, midnight sometimes, and they only start work in the morning at 10 o'clock, and that's fine. So I think each individual has to understand their own rhythms, and we all have different responsibilities in life. We have different caregiving responsibilities, parents, kids, whatever it might be. So it's important to find a working rhythm that works for you. Are there topics or angles? This is a question from Grace Tan. Are there topics or angles that are taboo to write about in Singapore, or are there ways to go around it? Yeah, definitely there are taboo areas. So one of the taboo areas in Singapore today, and I think the taboo areas, they're getting fewer and fewer. In the 1990s, there would have been a lot more taboo areas, but today there are fewer and fewer taboo areas. I think some of the big ones would be, for example, writing about the Lee family. People are still very, very scared to write about the Lee family, saying something bad about Lee Kuan Yew, who's now passed away, but even saying something, critical of our ex-Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, or his wife Ho Ching, or even Lee Hsien Yang or Lee Suet Fen. Anybody in the Lee family, I think there's still a bit of hesitation and fear about writing about them, which I don't think is very healthy. And I think that's another good thing about the fact that we have a new Prime Minister now, Lawrence Wong, because I think for a long time in our history, the Lee family has been so dominant, and now it's in a way it's healthy and productive that the Lee family is kind of no longer at the highest level of power, because it's important to be able to write openly and fairly and critically about anybody at all, including the Lee family. What might be some of the other taboo areas? I think religion is a taboo area. People don't often feel comfortable writing about religion for a whole bunch of reasons. And yeah, so there are certain or even racial issues. People don't always feel comfortable writing about racial issues. I think that's changing, and it's important that it changes, because at the end of the day, in order for a democracy to thrive and to survive, you need to be able to question everything, right? I don't think there can be any sacred cows in a democracy. So you need to be able to question and criticize, and fairly. I would say that I'd emphasize the point fairly. Journalism is important. Critical writing is important, but you always have to be fair. To be critical doesn't mean you have to slander somebody or be unfair to the person. You should always be kind to the person or the institution that you're writing about. You can be critical while being kind. And I think for a democracy to thrive, we need to be able to write critically about anybody or anything at all. And Grace, to your point of, are there ways to go around it? Yeah, I think this is true all over the world, that people find ways to go about it. It's not, when I say there are taboo areas, it's not just in Singapore. Obviously, in Singapore there are a lot, but taboo areas exist all over the world. Many people in the UK don't feel comfortable writing about the British monarchy as openly as they might, just as an example. So I think in each society, you need to figure out what the taboo areas are, and you need to figure out ways to get around it and write about it. Okay, Yale has what you say is the last question. Is there anything interesting happening now in the region, Singapore, that you are covering or want to cover? Yeah, I think what are the really interesting things going on now? I think, just to mention one example, if you think about the conflict in Israel and Gaza, or Israel and Palestine, I think for the first time in our history, Singapore's history at least, we're having quite an open, feisty conversation about it. And, there are many, many different viewpoints on what's going on there. There are many different viewpoints on how Singaporeans should respond. Whether Singapore should continue the same relationship we've always had with Israel and Palestine. And I think this is something new for me. I've never actually seen it before in my entire life, where Singaporean society is debating these issues quite openly, actually. It's true for many parts of the world, so it's not just in Singapore. And I think this is actually one of the most challenging areas to write about and to think about right now, because there are a lot of historical things that we have to take into account. There are a lot of contemporary aspects of life and about religion, ethnic issues in Singapore as well, that somehow relate to what's going on in Israel and Palestine. And I think, yeah, that's probably one of the more fascinating areas for us to write about right now. Yeah. So I think that's probably what I would end with.